Well, Tony, I've got 1 minute after 1 o'clock, and I think we can go ahead and get started. And I want to first of all say thank you to Tony Kruba, who put this session together twice now, because we are undaunted by a pandemic. As some of you might know, we had scheduled this session, I believe it was in April, it was last spring. And it complemented very nicely with our topics for the professional development out of the College of Arts and Sciences, because we wanted to do professional development last year, which was really about serving all of our students and thinking about diversity in a more expanded way. And so we had a session on serving the mental health needs of students. We had a session on serving international students, and we had a guest, Lori, from your home base with student access and accommodations. And then this was to be the last in the series of serving neurodiverse students. And then, we were delayed till this semester, but we're so happy we can come back and do this. The theme of this fits nicely still with the theme of our professional development for this year, because we have identified we want to talk about and privilege inclusive teaching this year. So we're going to kick off with this one, and it fits in very nicely with the theme this year as well. So to get us started, we have essentially a panel of 4 here with us today. We have Lori Hennihan, who's from the Division of Student Access and Accommodations Services. I think I might have said that right, Lori. We have Carla Depke, who's from our Department of Psychology, and Carla is also the director of TAPS, the Autism Place in our community. We have Dr. Berta Treitz, who is here as a panelist, and we have Dr. George Seelinger, who is also here as a panelist. So I think we'll start, Lori, with you, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you. Let me get my slides up here. Okay, can everyone see those okay?
Mm-hmm. Looks good, Lori.
Okay, great. So thank you, Dr. Zosky, for inviting us to come and speak about neurodiverse students. When we think about students who are neurodiverse learners, really what it means is that there's brain differences. Like we all have cognitive strengths and weaknesses, right? But for those who are a bit more neurodiverse, it's just that they have differences in their brain that can be very normal in some aspects, but are not as typical as what those of us, what our cognitive strengths and weaknesses are. And so as we're talking about this, I just want you to all know that our office is here as a resource to you. We're a resource for students, definitely, and their accommodations and their needs, but we're a resource to you too. So if there's ever a pickle that you're in, or a bind that you're in, and you just want to kind of talk that through, feel free to call us and talk to one of our coordinators. Back to neurodiversity, we're thinking about students particularly maybe who have like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, learning disabilities, traumatic brain injury. But I want to focus our time today a bit more on autism spectrum disorder, because the numbers are on the rise so much and they're rapidly growing. It's now 1 in 54 are individuals who have autism spectrum disorders. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But some of the strategies can be applied for all diverse learners, but particularly they can be helpful in this area. So when we think about this, there's the medical model of disability and there's the social model of disability. So I want to take some time and talk about that, because so much do we look at things from a very medical model perspective of disability. And the medical model is basically saying that there's something wrong with a person, right? That their symptoms, their diagnosis is something that needs to be fixed or changed. And that can be very disempowering for those that have diagnoses. It can be, and it can also lead people to feel like they're a victim. But we're all human beings, right? We all have goals, we all have aspirations, we all have a desire to work and engage in our community. So this medical model is very good in communicating about certain areas, but really what we need to look at is the social model of disability. And that's looking at our society as a whole. And what are the barriers that are in our society or on our campus that keeps people from being like fully engaged and getting the things that they need? What are those barriers what's the problem with our environment that makes that so? We want to give people in this area, we want to give them the independence, that they deserve, the choice, the control that they have, and seeing how their needs are met. Autism spectrum disorder, it's a neurologically based developmental disorder, and it affects someone's ability to communicate, socially interact, and engage in developmentally appropriate behaviors, which our society deems as appropriate. There's a spectrum to it, right? So one person's diagnosis may look very different from another person's diagnosis. And in the area of social communication, it can be someone that is completely not verbal at all to someone who is extremely verbal and asking you questions, constantly. In behaviors, it can be someone who, like, for example, they may have behaviors where they're hitting themselves on the head or self-harming, to a person who maybe just has a little bit odd or quirky behaviors, or maybe paces a lot or something like that. They can be very subtle. And then in the sensory realm, like an example could be someone could be completely hypersensitive to things in the environment, like noises, lights, things like that, versus someone who is hyposensitive, where they don't feel their senses the same that other people do. For example, like if you're out in the cold, 0-degree weather, maybe somebody's wearing shorts and a t-shirt, that's just not really appropriate. They're not really sensing the things like everyone else does. So each person has unique needs that are unique for them, and it may manifest itself in very different ways. So when you've met one person who has autism spectrum disorder, you simply met one person, okay? You can't exchange it across different people. No two are the same. This is what's happening in our education system in K through 12 in the state of Illinois. You're seeing the rise here, right? These are the students in the K through 12 system that have what are called individualized education plans. And that's the accommodation plan with the autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. And so these are the students that are receiving those interventions. This does not account for the students that are maybe homeschooled, or that maybe have what are called 504 plans, which is another accommodation plan in the state of Illinois in the education system, or those that are maybe diagnosed and just not receiving services. So we're reaching a whole new area in post-secondary education. Of course, we're seeing these students come to campus. We want them to come to campus. So we have, it's estimated between like 1% and 2% of college students have autism spectrum disorder, but that incompletion rate is 80%. And I would have to say that in my area, I'm a support service, right? So I'm not seeing that incompletion rate the same. So those that are getting the support services, they're having a bit more success, but still students have the ability to choose. And so we have a whole new area in higher education where there's this visibility of neurodiversity and autism spectrum. We have this increased commitment to diversity, and we also have the federal law. And so there's a whole new era right there. When you have a student, these are some of the things that you might see, okay? You might see a student with a very rigid thought process. They're very rigid in their thinking. They may be very insistent to having their questions answered. They may have different mannerisms. They may have a different tone of voice. It might be very monotone or maybe very high pitched. They may have motor differences in how they walk or in their gait, or they might have repeated behaviors, repeated movements. Difficulty planning ahead, managing responsibilities, and keeping things organized. Who doesn't with COVID, right? So some of our students may have this just a bit more. There may be uncertainty with social rules and in group dynamics, and they may have difficulty putting the pieces together but there's so many strengths that our students can bring to us. There's so many. They're outside of the box thinkers. They can be very intense and focused in their areas of interest. And that's why higher education is so cool for them, because it gives them a chance to explore that interest. They may bring about things that you've never thought of before. They may be catching things in the readings that you've never thought about before. They can be extremely reliable. They can be intelligent, have a strong attention to detail. And when they're given specific rules of what is expected, they can follow those and do exceptionally well. They can be very logical and propulsive, and they can bring about a really cool sense of humor once you get to know them. But disclosure can be so hard. It can be so hard for students because some of the students don't see what they have as necessarily a disability. And so that makes it a little bit difficult to accommodate them. And so in our office, you know, we have documentation, we have a process that they go through to get accommodations. So we have what I call the big A accommodations versus the little a accommodations, okay? These big A accommodations are the things that can come through our office. You're getting these faculty notification letters saying these accommodations are appropriate for this student, and so please apply these. But there's so many of these little a accommodations, and these are the things that are going on our campus as we speak, through housing, making connections, getting students registered with or signed up with registered student organizations, kind of behind the scenes things that we need to do as a campus so that our students feel welcome and feel like they belong in this environment. So some things to just incorporate into your class. We have instructional adaptations. These can be helpful for anyone, but whatever you say, put it in writing. Create visual things so that it gives a picture for a student to go by. Have your tools very structured and organized. When you're on your ReggieNet, you know, make it very clean and simple so that people can navigate through that. These are universal design concepts that are helpful for anyone. But when it comes to autism, you know, you can use idioms and double meaning and sarcasm, but when you use it, try to explain your usage if you need to, or be prepared to explain that. Words, absolute words like always and never, they can be a little bit distressing for someone who has autism, because what happens when that never actually happens? There may not be a protocol for them to go by. Use their interests to motivate them in their assignments and their work. Go for the overall meaning of concepts. And sometimes you might need to use details, like caution with details, meaning like if you get too much into the details, it can become more and more of a conversation about the details. So sometimes you just got to go for the overall meaning. But anytime you meet with a student, follow up with them with an email. Give them feedback. Allow time for them to respond. Try not to take things that may seem rude. Try not to take them personally. When you have behaviors that are not acceptable, try to reinforce acceptable behaviors and ways to coach them into ways to go. I want to talk a little bit about ambiguity and closure. You know, for some students, ambiguous things can be very difficult for them. So saying little words like, we can talk about this later, well, changing that to, like if a student's raising their hand constantly, saying, you know, we can talk about this during office hours, or we can talk about this at an appointment, can be so much more helpful for a student who's on the spectrum. And then think about grades. Like if a student really needs closure, they really need to know what their grade is. And they need that understanding and feedback as to how they're doing. It helps them. And so keep that in mind when you're grading students. And then lastly, like when you're faced with any sort of issue or problem or behavior, you know, try to think about the why. Why is this happening? And what are possible supports that can help in this situation? So I would have a student that would always be late to class, right? And it really came from like a history of just not being able, got to a point where it was just very overwhelming to go into class. So we had to talk through those things and figure out ways to support him in that so that he could get to a point where he could be successful because he was able to do the work, right? So just be thinking about those things. I know we have some excellent panelists today. I want to give them the time to talk because they bring about some very awesome perspectives. So thank you.
Thanks, Lori. And I don't know if we already asked you, but would you be willing to share those slides that we could
Yeah,
distribute?
absolutely. I think you already have them. I just made a little bit of adjustment.
Okay.
So how about I just email them to Denise?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Let me ask Carla if you'd like to kind of introduce yourself a little more further, Carla, and say a little bit.
Hi, I'm Carla Depke. I work in the Department of Psychology, but the reason I'm on this panel, I believe, is because I run the autism program at Illinois State University, which has been in existence for about 20 years now. And I've seen kids grow from very tiny all the way up through college. And I just want to echo some of the things that Lori has said. It is such a privilege to get to know people who have such a different perspective on the world, that gives you their unique perspective and gives you insight into a new way of thinking about things. I want to say, as college professors, it can sometimes be very difficult to have an individual who has difficulty with language in a class. And it's, I think, as humans, one of the most frustrating things for us is to be misunderstood. And so I think when you're working with somebody who has autism spectrum disorder, one of the first things you want to do is try to spend enough time to get to know them, to understand them, to let them know you're trying to understand them. And if they're asking a question, you're giving an answer, they're asking the same question, you're giving an answer, you're asking the same question, it's okay to say, wow, this is really tough for us. Seems like something that's really hard. Let's see if we can come at it a different way. Let's try another way and just kind of keep trying. I want to give time for questions and answers, but I also wanted to say sometimes the rigidity, and thinking is people's way to cope with a world that's really chaotic and unpredictable in a lot of ways. So sometimes this kind of, I need things to be the same, I want things to be the same, comes from a place of trying to have some control in the world. And we all, as humans, are uncomfortable with ambiguity. As we've experienced in COVID times, a lot of ambiguity. We've gotten probably a lot better with it, but it is very uncomfortable for someone who has autism spectrum disorder. And as I say that, the last thing I kind of want to bring home is I don't really think of it as a disorder per se. It's just kind of a way to be, and these are not my words, the words of other people, but a way of being uniquely human. It's a whole different perspective on the world. And it's, one that once you get to know and take the time to know is really, all people are trying to just cope, communicate, adapt to their environment, and do the best that they can. And I think having that approach with individuals, especially on the spectrum, who sometimes do some things that are hard to understand, to take the time to ask them why or try to figure out why they might be doing that. So I could talk for 5, 6, 7 hours, but I'm going to stop.
Thanks, Carla. And I so appreciate yours and Lori's discussion about shifting our framework from a deficit thinking to a strengths model. Roberta and George, would you want to further introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Roberta Seelinger-Treitz. I've been here at ISU since 1991. I'm a distinguished professor of English. This is my last year before retirement. And Carla's rocking along with me. I'm here in a dual role. I teach a lot of teacher education students. When I'm teaching in English, I teach adolescent literature. And I've had 2 students that I was aware of were on the spectrum. One who navigated 2 of my classes quite successfully, and one who did not. So I'm here in one capacity to talk about what worked and what didn't in my own classroom. But I am married to my fabulous husband, George Seelinger. And we have a son who's now 25. He had a difficult time in the lab schools in K to 8 because he had a lot of teachers who were not trained in how to teach autism. He went to the autism place, and Dr. Depke was very, very helpful and supportive and teaching us and some of his teachers how he learns. And we can talk more about John in a minute. He's in his last year, he's a history major with an African American studies minor. He's doing quite well. When he was in ninth grade, he transferred to Bloomington High School, where he had far more professional help and support. For example, his social worker, Sona Shali, and I'm really glad to see you on this call, even if I can't see your face, Sona. She was his social worker. He worked with a speech pathologist. He worked with the school psychologist. Hey, Sona, thank you. And he had a whole team of support, including teachers who were trained in how to teach students English or science or math. He did, by his junior year, move entirely into general education classes, thanks to people like Sona. So I just wanted to say that John is succeeding here at ISU because of a team of people. It's not up to any one professor. His theater teacher at Bloomington told me when she cast him in a play in his freshman year, you can't raise him by yourself. It takes a community. So I'm grateful to all of you for being here to be part of this learning community. George?
So I want to echo what Roberta said. So, you know, I'm here dual role, both as the chair of the mathematics department, but also as John's father as well, and reflecting on some of the experiences he's had. And the teachers he's had and the professors he's had both at Heartland. I see some professors here who've had him at ISU as well. And
Correct.
so I thank all those professors as well. And I've been impressed with the efforts people have made to work with our son. You know, I appreciated what Lori said and Carla echoed about some things just from our experience. I mean, but I want to echo that our experience with our son echoes what Lori said. If you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism. But there is also some of the, some things that we've noticed have been effective, that have been helpful. Some things that we've noticed that John sometimes will have some anxiety about, some things that I think are helpful. And some of the things as people were talking that I wanted to emphasize were I think in this realm of people being online, we've had to be more conscious about being more explicit about our instructions and what we're doing in our instruction. And I've found that always helps our son. When that happens, I find sometimes that he has difficult following verbal instructions, especially when they get complex, that having those written out have been very helpful for him. It's been helpful for us to support him on that. But it's also, you know, but I think that also helps benefit the rest of the students as well, because I think Lori said something about a lot of these techniques will also benefit students in general. I know when I've participated in a previous panel in a different context, that disclosure is a big deal, because I think when I talk to others, some of it is you don't know sometimes when you have somebody on the spectrum in the class. And you just have to sort of infer that sometimes, or try to figure out how to work with somebody like that. And so I appreciate what Lori said about some of the identifying characteristics. But I think that one of the things I want to sort of emphasize is this autism spectrum disorder. It's a spectrum. And so sometimes people may not be officially diagnosed, but maybe still somewhere on the spectrum. I mean, people argue, you know, there's an element of somebody like myself even, but you know, that it is a spectrum, and so it's a little bit hard to infer, but I think some of the techniques that we talk about and some of the accommodations are helpful not only for these students, but also our students in general.
Can I jump in there, George?
Yeah.
So from 7th to 8th grade, John was still at Metcalf, and one of the teachers in the 8th grade, 7th, 8th grade block wasn't prepared at all to teach someone on the spectrum. So I worked with closely with the principal. I worked closely with their school counseling support staff, and they gave me an office, and John and I learned language arts and history 2 hours a day. My undergrad is in history. I teach children's and adolescent literature. I learned more about myself as a teacher in those 2 years than in the rest of my career put together. And I learned it from John. I mentioned that I had 2 students, one who succeeded, one who did not. I had the student who did not really succeed before, I mean, he passed the class, but with a great deal of uncomfortableness. His classmates were uncomfortable. He was uncomfortable. He would fall asleep whenever, he got to that point where he'd spoken 6 times in 10 minutes, and I'd suggest it was someone else's turn. His only coping mechanism was to visibly fall asleep in the whole class. We sit in a circle. Everybody felt bad, especially me. Well, I shouldn't say especially, I don't know. Other people might have felt worse, but it was bad. Teaching John, I learned that if it's not visually presented, it's just not going to process. I'm one of those lecturers who likes to stride around the room and be dramatic. And those of you who know me know this is very true. You can look at Carla giggling, and Tony too. I like to talk a lot, as you can already tell, even if you don't know me. That does not work for most students anymore. And so what happened when I started teaching John is I became more aware that I'm an auditory learner and not everyone is. So I've started everything I do, I put it up on the whiteboard or the chalkboard. Every single piece of information students need, it's available to them in a visual or written format. I'm not so good with charts as some people are. That's George's department in our house. But I cannot emphasize enough, if you have that student who's talking too much without seeming to understand your responses, if you have that student who's falling asleep as a coping mechanism, if you have that student who's fidgeting constantly and making guttural noises or something else Tourette's-like, please consider working with that student one-on-one and just start by asking, can I give you some visual formatting that will help? This is where note takers become especially important. John has had quite a few note takers who were the nicest people in the world, but they didn't know what was important. And we would try to help him, just review for a test, and the notes wouldn't make sense even to us. Some of the misspellings have been hysterical. And so what has helped him the most is when people have been willing to type them into Word or using a laptop in class even, and then email them to him, but copy the professor so that the professor can take the time to double check what's there, what's not there. And that way when John goes to take a test, someone has taken notes for him, but if they've completely missed the boat, the professor can intervene. The student who succeeded after I started some of these techniques in my classroom partly succeeded because she had excellent note takers, and I made sure of that. I personally asked the person who I perceived to be the best student in the class, it was usually someone I'd had before, who I knew took notes on a laptop. I personally asked that person to be the note taker rather than just letting somebody volunteer so they could put it on the resume, who then never gave John the notes, which has happened. I also then worked one-on-one with that student to make sure her visual needs were being accommodated with my oral and oral style. But most important, I gave her feedback that she asked for, and that helped. When she was worried that she was talking too much, we kind of developed a little check and balance, non-visual, I mean, a visual cue kind of thing. And if I went like this, she knew that meant, okay, give us a second. And you're interesting, and I'll do it with a smile. And as long as I was smiling, she felt so grateful. We formed quite a bond after 2 semesters, and she did quite well in my class, especially the second one.
Those practical suggestions and practical experiences are really helpful, Roberta and George, both of you. I want to open up, there might be questions among you in the in our room here that you would want to ask any one of our 4 presenters. And if so, just feel free to unmute and speak up.
Oh, I see a lot that's happening in the chat.
Yeah, in the
I'm paying attention.
I thought maybe I ask a question. Also, some people had raised this in the beginning of the chat. So I basically, as a scientist, I would just be interested, why is there a rise of cases in the autism spectrum? Is it different diagnostics, or is that environmental different, that the environment now is different, that the society can accommodate people on the spectrum less? Yeah.
Wow, that's $1 million question. And there is some evidence that we're getting better at diagnosing it at younger ages. However, that doesn't account for the great rise in the disorder, because if that was the case, something else would be going down. And so there is some genetic, environmental components to it. And also, I think as medicine gets better, where fetuses are able to survive more through a lot of things. So it's definitely on the rise. That's my best shot at an answer.
Thank you.
I want to call out, Joan had a question in here, and I had a very similar question. So if I think you can read it in the chat. One of my biggest challenges is facilitating engagement and understanding of other students, especially when the student on the spectrum has sensitivities for noise or may struggle with informal social cues. Any thoughts on how to facilitate that more effectively? And I would extend upon that, because part of my question was to do that in the classroom that saves face and grace for everybody, that there's not any embarrassment for any of the students.
I have found that the professors that work best with John are the professors who are both flexible, well, I should say 3 things: flexible, very clear about their expectations, but unafraid to work with him one-on-one in non-shaming ways. Wow, you have so many ideas and your classmates are interested. So why don't you, check in with me if, you should share one of those ideas or 5 of those ideas. I'm going to shout out to Tony, shout out to Linda, Torrey Reed also. Torrey figured out sarcasm didn't work. He really hurt John's feeling at one point. And Torrey was great. He explained what had happened to John. He went into the next class, and now anytime he's being sarcastic, he doesn't single John out. He says, now I hope you guys understand that was sarcasm. And he just turns the whole thing into something that makes everybody feel included. I think the most important way, in my opinion, is to assume that everyone wants to feel included and know what's going on. And that's where the professor really does need a great deal of flexibility in how you communicate with students, especially during group discussions.
I love Dr. Wu. I love your comment in the chat here. And Shenzhen has just joined us in the Department of Psychology, and I believe in school psychology. Am I right on that? Am I right on that? Right. And I love this tip, some preventative strategies like decreasing noise in the environment, reminding the students about upcoming noisy environment, and teaching social cues using modeling, repeated practice, and corrective feedback would help. Those are very good suggestions. You know, the noise in terms of, and I don't know if the four of you have any comment about this, but the almost the saturating or the overwhelming sensory stimuli can be an issue.
Yeah. I liked Sona's response in the chat. Thank you for that. But it works for some students and it doesn't for others. John himself is something of a noisemaker. He's a little Tourette's-y, and he's offended a couple of faculty members by either yawning and stretching too loud, which one of my autistic students did, or you know, weird type stimulating noises with his mouth. Those are harder to talk about, and you might, if you run into those kind of really problematic physical behaviors, you might want to pick up the phone and call accommodation services and ask for their help. They may not be able to talk to you about the individual student, but if it's a specific distracting physical behavior, I do think they offer some good one-on-one pieces of advice based on the different behavior.
Yeah, I would echo all of those comments. And also, when talking about group projects and having people do groups, I think some of the ways that professors can set it up so it's successful, not just for people on the spectrum, but in general, is to allow time at the beginning for them to get to know each other, identify strengths, talk about how they learn best, how they communicate best, what are their areas that they can contribute better. And I think also the expectation is you're doing a group project not just for a grade. You're doing a group project to learn how to get along with people who have different strengths, and that I think just should be emphasized. And if something comes up, you know, help them problem solve through it. And there are some social cues that individuals with autism don't understand, but once they're told, or they're like, hey, you give 2 ideas and then it's someone else's turn. You gave a rule for it, you help them navigate that, and then they'll follow that. That'll make more sense to them.
I also encourage, in group projects, 2 things I would encourage. Our son would prefer to work with a group, but I know many students on the spectrum who prefer to work alone. I always like to see that be an option, even just for the anxious students. And I really appreciate, I think Dr. Carlson brought up the anxious students. When John was 4 years old, he was diagnosed with anxiety disorder. He was only 7 or 8 when he was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. They're the same treatment, it turns out, for young kids, the same medication, the same therapies. And so we didn't do anything wrong in those 4 years that we missed his diagnosis. Mm-hmm. If you treat your autism students the same way you treat your highly anxious students, you're going to have a better classroom anyway, because you all have anxious students. All of us do. We've seen the numbers. We know it's on the rise. There's not one of you teaching someone who's not highly anxious. So that reassurance and that reminder, and that here's the goal for you to meet today. Don't think about the whole semester, think about today. Those kind of incremental thinking, that, and the visual stuff, helps the anxious students as well as the students on the spectrum.
You know, I will say with group projects, I just want to jump in here, is that it is something where the students have to socially negotiate, and this can be difficult for some of the autistic students. I found some of the, well, I think also with neurotypical students, it can be difficult to do that negotiation, but I think also with the autistic students, what I found has been successful is when there's somebody who can sort of be a leader in the group and help distribute the tasks, And sometimes that may require, a group may not have a leader, and I think that sometimes requires some involvement from the professor to help guide that particular group, give some extra guidance with that.
I want to call out that Shanna Carlson, you have several good recommendations in the chat in terms of decibel lowering, smaller headsets, headphones, and fidget rings, those sorts of things.
Yeah, so I started working with autism spectrum students in about 2010. I originally started with third grade mostly. And the thing that would allow for them to stimulate themselves or to take down stimulus when necessary, but that would not call attention to anything about them, seemed to make them feel more comfortable and actually more willing to work in the group environment, like in a class discussion or anything like that. So I also suggest some of those things to when I have students that come in that are really anxious as well. And that seems to, I mean, I know it's not going to work for everybody, but it seems to be a couple of the things that are showing to be repetitively helpful.
Great. Those are good practical suggestions.
We have found too that when John's in a group project, he's one of those people with a phenomenal memory. Very, very good. Carla again is laughing because she knows how right I am about this. But he's phenomenal with dates and people's names. And I mean, if you want to know who the vice president was in 1847 and what that guy's birthday was, John can tell you. You don't even have to think about it.
Can I just say he gave me a PowerPoint on that
Yeah,
when he was in my class.
Surprised, Linda. Yeah,
It was fabulous.
that one out a lot. But when his classmates rely on him to do fact finding and fact writing, he does quite well. But when they decide, well, you're a visual learner, so you're in charge of the visuals, that doesn't work so well. He's not good at graphics. He's not good at computer science. He's not good at technology. He's not good at math. That was also true of the woman who succeeded in my autism, who had autism in my 2 classes. Everybody made all these assumptions about her, and she stunk at most of the stuff that is, you know, Sheldon on The Big Bang Theory. Neither John or this student, neither one of them could do those things. So if professors can kind of help guide a group to figure out the students, the learners' strengths, and assign that portion to the group project, it really helps.
I also think our generation of students, they've grown up with students in their classes that have been included over time, and our students can be exceptionally helpful, and they pick up on it well before you do, you know, as a professor. And so sometimes just encouraging groups that have students that are more understanding can be helpful, or if you even need to step in and assign a group, you know, that can be helpful as well. But, you know, credit to our students that really get it.
And Lori, you know who gets it the most is the teacher education majors. They're usually the first people to spot somebody on the spectrum, sometimes before I do. Mm-hmm. And that's it. And it's because they're going into teaching for the right reasons. They have had these different learners in their classes all the way through. And John has found them to be some of his best partners, his history education colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
No, I did also want to bring up that I know that our son sometimes struggles with ambiguity. He wants, you know, who's right, who's wrong sort of thing. And that's not always appropriate in the college classes. And so sometimes I think these students need help negotiating that and working with how do you deal with some of that ambiguity that is just part of the discipline. And so I think, you know, I don't have good suggestions. I just say I think want people to be aware of that issue. It's not that they're incapable. I think it's just they struggle with that ambiguity for some of the reasons that Carla and Laurie have said. So, so I think that's just something to be aware of as you teach these students.
Although Sally has never directly taught John, she's interacted with him quite a bit. And I would imagine Sally, Tony, or Linda would all have examples of stories where John is simply not going to accept that we don't know the answer to a historical problem. I mean, Tony's grinning. Do you want to give an example? I don't want to put you on the spot. You're muted, darling. There you go.
Or, just something as basic as what caused the French Revolution, world historical event. How can historians not know something so momentous and so obvious, right? There has to be a set answer that we all agree on for something of such significance. So yes, that's one of them. And I loved having John in my class. He taught me a lot about myself, and appreciate your support.
Yeah, you bet. He made me a better teacher.
I'm going to guess, Tony, that his John's questioning probably really caused you to reflect a little more deeply on his ideas, right?
Absolutely. I'm not a sarcastic professor, but I tongue-in-cheek use a sense of humor, kind of straight face. So I had to learn pretty quickly to explain myself in the classroom, because I goof around a lot and didn't always work, I think.
I'm wondering, Linda has an important topic and idea in the chat, and I'm wondering if the four of you have any thoughts about this, as we're living through remote learning now since March, and any ideas on how to help our students who are, not getting face-to-face practice with social interacting.
One of the things, so John is taking African American literature with a grad assistant, I don't know, in English. And she's doing a phenomenal job of having the peers interact with each other, not in a sort of cliched, trite sort of, here's a statement and now you all either agree or disagree. But she's kind of almost controlling the conversation to ensure that they're actually having peer interactions, that they're responding to one another in meaningful ways. She might ask a question. Okay, what did the rest of you think about Peter's comment that blah? So she's very hands-on in controlling the chat and the discussion so that students can't just write kind of fluffy answers. I think that's helping John. Another thing that's helping him is when he does have the synchronous class, he has one with Tony Adeje, and he couldn't quit telling us yesterday how funny it was when they were talking about King Tut Diane Young, and all the students on the side had this chat going on about King Tut being, well, mommy, I'm a baby, and he recited probably every single joke that was made. The students were then also in the chat horsing around about the pyramids being proof that there are aliens from outer space built them. And they were all horsing around. Dr. Adeje was laughing his head off too. He promised them if they could come up with substantive proof as a class that aliens do exist, that they wouldn't have to take the second exam. And they're all dying laughing. So so one class is synchronous, one is asynchronous, but the professor in both cases, or the instructor in both cases, is facilitating actual student interaction. And it's making a huge difference for John.
I think from John's perspective, this was also, I think, Linda, sort of the concerns you have are in part some of my concerns for all students in general in terms of trying to get them and interacting, engaging, getting a sense of community within the class. I think that's really a challenge, and I am impressed with the various things people do to make that happen. I know for John, sometimes it's a matter of feeling heard, even with face-to-face classes, even with the ambiguity. If he's got a viewpoint, if he feels like he's not being listened to or heard, then he gets very frustrated. And sometimes that means instead of the 5 things he has to say, having the professor say basically, you know, I'd like to hear more, but after class or something like that, if it's detracting. But I think ways for students to feel heard, I think, are going to be important.
I would also like to bring up one other obstacle that I've seen both in the students I teach, I think in some of Georgia's students on the spectrum, and with our son. A lot of people on the spectrum, I have a friend who's the same age as John, and was a triple major in physics, chemistry, and math. Graduated in 4 years, brilliant kid, but he couldn't show his work. He knew the answer to the math formula. He could not show his work. He didn't understand the reason why anybody would want him to if he had the answer right. Now, this is, you know, kind of pre-proof. I'm not talking about, you know, the stage of mathematics where you have to write out the proving it part, but long division, you know. He got a lot of points taken off for that. John had one faculty member who took off a point every time he used the word very. And he's, you know, very strong-minded kid, so he uses emphasis a lot. And he ended up doing quite poorly in the class because the teacher was grading I learned how to write from my history professors, not my English professors. I'm sorry, Dr. John, I don't mean in any way to crack on English professors, you know that. But I learned historians are very scrupulous in their writing. And one of the things we learned when he was at Heartland was that the professors had been trained to acknowledge that the end result is the learning. The end result isn't the picky little details. It's the overall conceptual learning. Have you progressed? And it helped so much. It helped me become a less pedantic grader. I do have a reputation for being a grammar Nazi. But it helped me recognize that I needed to separate out, is the student's conceptual learning progressing, or am I just hung up on the semicolons? Because that's my problem. That's not the students. And so the Heartland system of assessing the student's actual gained knowledge rather than the pedantic details, that really helped me as a professor, and it has helped John as a student when he's had those professors. Oh, Julie, I love it. Thank you for telling me that.
We have a competition in the chat about who are the best teachers.
Well, and Tony's right. There's no unnecessary adverbs, but good luck on telling John that one. Telling him that's in 7th grade.
I wanted to kind of respond to Linda's comment about being worried about students on the autism spectrum who've been off. I think I've heard, not at the college level, but at the high school level, so many parents are saying, my kid is living their best life right now. They don't have to struggle with the complex social things that are difficult to understand, or the extra noises or anything. And the instruction is clearer, and there are visuals that go along with it as people have been more intentional about that. So in some respects, I think their anxiety is lower, and they're able to focus more, and they really can thrive in learning. Now, going back to social environments is going to be anxiety provoking and hard. And I think that's one of those things that we just have to be sensitive to.
So Linda, our provost has very wisely said, we have to think about what this is going to look like on the other end of C19. And I think the question you're raising is going to be a question for absolutely everyone, whether it's the anxious students, the depressed students, those with physical learning disabilities, cognitive learning disabilities, even the perfectly neurotypical solid B student. We are going to have to, as an institution, all institutions of higher learning are going to have to grapple with reteaching our students how we do this. people like me been doing it for 30 years. I could imagine myself just jumping back in and picking up where I left off. None of our students next fall are going to be able to pick up from where I was when I was teaching in 1996. So I think, Linda, your point is an exemplary one. Thank you.
If I can ask a quick question, kind of following from Linda's, I wonder, when we return to face-to-face, the kind of people anticipate, that some of the tools we've learned online are not going to go away, right? We're either going to be reincorporating them or they're going to be more hybrid methods. And so I just wonder if some of the affordances on online, if some of those can be carried forward and be useful, so that, if anyone has any thoughts about specific tools or something, text-based communication is different from face-to-face, and trying to keep both tracks going. Thoughts about that, because, I think we all recognize that these online tools will be a part of teaching going forward as well, even when we return to face-to-face. And that could be to the benefit of a range of learners. So if anyone had any thoughts about that.
Well, my thoughts is, I think just in general that I think you're right, things have changed, and I think people are gonna, I think one of the biggest challenges with incorporating some of the online tools is getting faculty to be familiar with them and being able to use them effectively. I think we have great faculty who are creative and really devote a lot of effort toward teaching. And now that they are familiar with these tools, perhaps maybe this is not the way they wanted to learn them, but they've learned them. I think they can adapt those to the face-to-face environment and enhance that learning environment. When I'm thinking about mathematics, for instance, people who may have forgotten a topic, well, maybe there can be an online module or something where they can review things. And so I see some of the more explicit instructions, and thinking about how we present things or how we give instructions to students. I see that as being incorporated in that. Perhaps maybe have some more asynchronous discussions using things like Flipgrid or chat rooms more effective uses of ReggieNet. I see that going forward as even if you have a face-to-face class, a way to really incorporate and enhance that, so it's so that you can use the class time more productively. I like what CTLT did in terms of thinking about how you're actually using that face-to-face time, and how you can support that with some of the asynchronous stuff or some of the online stuff, and maybe perhaps putting that in that focus. But I think that's where we're headed.
I agree, especially about Flipgrid.
You've got 1 minute. Does anybody want to have a last question or the last word, Roberta?
Well, you know me, I always have to have the last word. I just want to thank all the people here who care about not just our son. There are a number of people here who know him and have really helped him. And I want to thank those people specifically, but all of you are helping students with needs, whether they're anxious or whatever. And I want to express gratitude, because we're part of the solution. Those of us who care and who are trying to change how we teach to get better, we're part of the solution. And I want to express my gratitude, Tony, to you for putting this together, and to all of you for caring.
I'll second your thanks to everybody for being here and for caring, and express my gratitude, especially for our 4 excellent panelists, Lori, Carla, George, Roberta. Thank you very much for this very enlightening hour. And we will reconvene at the next workshop. So thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend. Enjoy the rest of your Friday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
everyone.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.